I have a collection of seashells. Some of them I've bought and others I've collected over the years. Recently, when I did a bit of cleaning up, I sorted all of my shells into some containers, and doing that inspired me to paint some of them. In this video, I'll show you how I set up the shells for this painting, and I'll share with you the techniques I used to paint them. If you like what I do and you get value from my videos, make sure you hit the like button. And if you are new to my channel, be sure to subscribe because I post new watercolor tutorials like this one every week. All right, let me show you how I set up the shells before I painted them. I laid this piece of white cardboard on the table. Then I got my shells and I started to lay them out. At first I thought I'd place them individually, side by side, but nothing I set up really inspired me. Then I had an idea. I got all of my violet KK shells and I spread them out on the paper, and I moved them around a little into an arrangement that I thought was pleasing. Because they were violet in colour, I thought it would be interesting if I got some larger shells with yellow colourings on them. That way I'd be able to use complementary colours in my painting. So I grabbed these two shells. They've got browny, yellowy markings on them, and I placed them on top of the KK shells. I turned on my lamp and I positioned my phone over the top of them, and I started taking some photos that I could use as reference. While I was doing that, little Leo was busy destroying a piece of wheat that I was planning to paint at some stage. I probably spent about 40 minutes or so arranging the shells in different ways, and this is what I ended up with. One thing I'll show you in this video is how I faded the colour away as I moved away from the two main shells. The two larger shells were my focal point, so that's where I put the greatest tonal variation. As I moved my way down the painting, the colours became softer and more muted. The paper I used was Arches cold press, 300 pounds, so this is quite thick. I used 4 Winsor & Newton colours: French ultramarine, burnt sienna, permanent rose and yellow ochre. As well as the tutorials here on YouTube, I have watercolour classes on Patreon. There are currently over 150 classes, so if you are wanting to improve your painting skills, I've got plenty of things to share with you over there. Each class on Patreon includes the reference photos, the line drawing and progress photos of my painting to make it easy for you to follow along and paint with me. I'll be posting this simplest shell painting later this year, and the link to Patreon is in the description of this video. The first thing I did was paint a splash of cool grey onto the background. I mixed some burnt sienna with some French ultramarine. I wet the paper all over, and then I painted the grey onto the wet paper. I tilted my board so that the paint would wander over the paper. I let that dry, and then I used that same cool grey to start washing in the smaller shells. I mixed a darker grey using burnt sienna and French ultramarine again. I used freshly squeezed pigment when I mixed this. The brush I'm using is only slightly damp, so that when I pick the paint up, I can make sure that the paint mixture is quite dark. I don't have to pick it up with a wet brush. So that was French ultramarine. This is burnt sienna. I need more French ultramarine. I mixed the two together to make a dark grey. I also mixed some permanent rose into French ultramarine to make violet. Then I started to add some detail to these little shells. I wet the main area of the shell with water, but I avoided the lighter areas. So that little horseshoe shape at the top, I'm not wetting that. While the paper was wet, I painted on the violet mixture. That's the French ultramarine mixed with permanent rose. And then I picked up some of the darker grey that I mixed and I started to paint that onto the wet paper. The brush I'm using is my No. 3 Da Vinci Maestro. When I got the darker grey paint where I wanted it, I washed the paint out of my brush and then I used it to spread the paint out where I wanted it. And I blended it a bit more. Not too much though. And I started to paint in the darker areas on the top section of the shell on dry paper, just using the grey mixture. I picked up a little bit more grey and I painted a few directional strokes. And that was my first little shell painted in then. And I repeated that process on other shells. I wet the paper first. I used the violet mixture and then the darker grey. Here I'm using a little zero brush. And then I switched to a larger brush and I took a touch of paint back off with this one. I washed in a few more shells with the same mixture that I used on the background. This is burnt sienna mixed with French ultramarine, but it's got a bit of water mixed with it so that it's not too dark. With the shells that were turned the other way, I drew some pencil lines onto them to follow. And then I used my little liner brush and some of the darker grey and I painted over the pencil lines on dry paper. I varied the thickness of the lines slightly and I left the white of the paper showing between them. When that was dry, I wet it with some water all over. And then I painted some grey along the edges to create some shadows. I also painted it over the bottom edge of the shell to darken that area. I repeated that process on the other shells and then I started to paint in the shadows that surrounded the shells with the dark grey. When I put the paint on heavily like that, the colour is almost black. I dragged some of that colour onto the shell itself as well, just to increase the shadow there. And then I softened the edge along the shell. I do that with a slightly damp brush. Here on this other side of that shell, I'm wetting it with a bit of water. I paint the grey mixture down into that little crevice between the shells, and then because the shell is wet, the paint creeps onto the edge of it. Just getting a bit more paint there. And here I use my little brush to pull it back across some of those lines that I created earlier. If I go astray anywhere, I use another brush, clean, with just a bit of water on it to tidy things up. With all of the shells that were surrounding the larger shells, I made the colours that I was using quite dark. This area is my focal point, so here is where I want to draw the eye. Here is where I will place most of the contrast. I used a combination of the violet mixture and the dark grey, and then I used the lighter grey on the outer sections of the shells. When the lighter sections were dry, I came back and painted in a bit of detail with my little liner brush, the 0. On some of the shells, I ended up dropping a little bit of water onto the drying paint to create some really small watercolor blooms. That helped to create a bit of texture here and there. Here I've painted the violet first, and now I've got the grey that I'm painting around the edges. And I paint a few directional strokes through the middle of the violet as well while it's damp. I painted in the shells behind this one, then I re-wet the inside part of this one, and I've got some of the darker grey there so I can deepen that shadow right at the top. On this shell here, I wet the paper. I've got some of the grey mixture, but I've put a bit more French ultramarine into it. Then I pick up the darker grey. I leave some of the lighter underwash showing. I don't completely cover it with this second layer of paint. And for interest, I paint a bit of the violet on there as well. That's a mixture of permanent rose and French ultramarine. And here I'm back onto the dry paper again with the grey mixture. And again, I vary the width of the strokes that I'm painting on so that they're all not the same. I wanted to paint in all of the purple KK shells first, and then after I'd finished those, I painted in the main 2 shells. As I moved away from those main 2 shells, I started to decrease my tonal values. So I had to ignore the information that the reference photo was giving me. So I've done a fair amount of work there now with the dark tonal values. Now I thought I would jump down to the shell that I've got right at the bottom. I'll paint that one in, and I'll keep my colours really pale so that there's not a great deal of tonal variation. My technique was the same with this shell. I painted the grey and then the violet, and I left some of the lighter underwash showing, but you can see that my colours are much softer. And I don't need to put as much detail down here. Here I've got some of the darker grey, but I've watered it down so that it's not too dark. I pat it onto the wet paper. I've painted in a few more of them now down at the bottom of the painting, and you can see how I'm keeping the colour quite pale on all of them. Sometimes I worked on wet paper and other times I worked on dry paper. Here I'm on dry paper. I paint the violet on first, and then I get the grey and paint that on the darker side. And because I don't wait for the violet to dry, the 2 colours blend together You get that lovely soft edge where they touch one another. I tried to keep the layers of paint to a minimum when I painted the shells. I know that that first layer of paint is always the freshest, so I tried as much as I could to minimise the layers of paint that I was painting on them. When I had most of them painted in, I started to paint in the rest of the cast shadows. The cast shadows up higher were much darker than the shadows that I'm painting down here. I painted the cast shadows on dry paper, and I used my brush to soften any edges that I needed to. I used my eradicator brush over the top of the shells that had the lines on them to take a bit of paint off. I wanted to soften the look of all those lines a little, so I wet the brush and I rubbed gently on the paper, and then I used some paper towel to take a bit of the paint off. That gave them a bit more texture as well. I have a link for this brush in the description of the video. So this is what it looked like at this stage before I started to paint in the larger shells. The colour softens away at the bottom. And then I've got a bit more colour around those two main shells. With these two shells, I worked on wet paper. So here I'm wetting the shell on the left with some water. And then when it was completely wet, I used some yellow ochre. I left some of the white of the paper showing. I didn't completely cover it with the yellow ochre. Now I get some thicker pigment, still using yellow ochre, and I paint that onto the wet paper. I want some darker areas now. I follow the shape of the shell with my strokes. As I said, I'm determined to get the shell painted in one go. I don't want to have to layer over the top of it if I can help it. Okay, my paper is still wet enough. I can keep working on it. So I'm going to pick up a bit of my grey mixture now. This is the burnt sienna French ultramarine mixture. I'm going to paint this on this side where I see a little shadow on the reference photo. Then I switched to my little zero brush and I got myself some more pigment, much thicker this time. And I painted some more darker areas with this. I used the little brush because I wanted fairly fine lines and I didn't want to flood the paper with paint. I left that one to dry, and then I got some water on this shell over here. I used the grey mixture again to paint in the shadow that ran up the right-hand side. I could see a little bit of a shadow on this side as well, some grey areas. I didn't wait for that to dry. I went straight in with the yellow ochre again, working on the wet paper. Starting to paint a few little directional strokes here. Then I washed the paint out of my brush and I used it slightly damp to spread the paint out a little. And then I I started to paint in the stripes that ran across the shell. Still using yellow ochre, but it's fairly pale. And it was still wet enough for me to continue on, so I got some more of the yellow ochre with my zero brush. This time the pigment is heavier, and I start to add a few darker areas onto the wet paper. But then it was starting to dry, so I ended up waiting until it was completely dry. And then I continued on with the darker pigment on the dry paper, just adding a few little darker areas on those yellow stripes here and there. I painted them on, and then if I felt I needed to soften any paint edges, I used my other brush, slightly damp with water, and I softened the edges away. I had to extend the top of the shell a little here. I didn't have it quite high enough, so I drew in the top section. And then I painted it in with the grey paint that's on dry paper there. But again, I softened any edges that I needed to with my other brush. For this line along here, I wet the paper first so that the paint would bleed. And here I've got some burnt sienna. And the paper's damp. I also wet this little yellow stripe, and I painted a tiny bit of burnt sienna on it while it was wet. And then I got my brush and softened the edges a bit more. I did that on each of the thicker stripes. And here I've wet the paper as well, and I've got a bit more of my grey mixture. I don't think my shadow was quite dark enough there. I also painted a bit more grey onto the shell. As I said, I was hoping to avoid that, but my colour wasn't dark enough when I did it originally, so I had to do it again. Then I went back to this shell and I painted on the top section of it. That's a bit of yellow ochre on the wet paper there. I wet the main part of the shell with water, and I painted a grey edge along the bottom of it. And a bit more yellow ochre here, and I left the white of the paper showing where I needed to. Because I like to repeat colours in the painting, so if I use a colour somewhere, I like to try and put it somewhere else in the painting. Here I'm painting a bit of yellow ochre onto some of these shells. Just a hint of colour, not too much. After I painted the main two shells in, I went back and deepened the colour on some of the shells that surrounded these shells. So this is the mixture of French ultramarine and burnt sienna, but it's quite dark, it's almost black. I painted it onto the dry paper, and then I used my damp brush to soften away the edges. There were a few different areas where I needed to add more of a shadow. Here I'm working on wet paper to paint that darker black mixture. So I'm trying to increase the contrast around those main larger shells. I stood back and looked at it, and I made the decision to paint a bit of yellow ochre onto the background as well. I didn't want to overdo it, so I painted on the wet paper like I did the grey, and I kept the colour fairly pale. I'm always concerned when I do this after I've put so much work into the painting and then I start to play around with the background. I worry that I might mess it up somehow, but I knew it needed something, so I was determined to make it work. I know that it's best to let one temperature dominate a painting. This is a comparatively cool painting, so I knew that if I was to put any yellow ochre onto the background, I needed to do it sparingly. I put the paint on and then I lifted the board off the table to make the paint flow. If I got any of it on the shells, I just got some paper towel and patted it off. Again, I stood back and looked at the painting and felt that I needed a bit more colour up in this top right corner. So I painted some yellow ochre up there as well. I also dropped a bit of grey up in there while it was wet to break it up a bit. I dried that off, re-wet it with water, and then I put a bit more yellow ochre there, a little bit darker this time. And while I was doing that, little Leo was having fun in my water container. And it's not easy painting with him in the studio, but I don't like to leave him in the house on his own. Finally, I was happy with it, so I took the washi tape off. And then I cut it from my board. And there it is, finished. This was a fairly detailed painting, but it didn't take me that long because I didn't agonise over the KK shells. I added as much detail as I thought I needed without painting everything that I saw. As I mentioned earlier, I will post a tutorial of this simpler shell painting on my Patreon site when I get it finished. Hopefully I gave you a few helpful tips. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. I have a collection of seashells. Oh, it is after the intro, sorry. Where will I go from, as well as the tutorials here on YouTube? In this video. There are current... I think that should be a B-roll. I'll be posting this. Yeah, I don't want to hold it in front of the camera. Hopefully I gave you a few helpful tips.